less opportunities for exposure. Many of these children do not have a computer in their homes. They may have one phone through which they access. So they don't have the kind of access that others may have. So it's and also doing with your own hand, you learn much more than if you're just taught theory in a book. So I just wanted to mention that because that program happened this morning. We had invited all the children to come and give some feedback, but also give them some, something to remember their course. Just let's go back to the topic, which is lessons for science from the pandemic. And of course, having been in the very thick of it, even today when I look back, it's almost like a haze over the last, especially the first few months of the pandemic was very difficult for everybody, but also for us and WHO, because we had an added responsibility of giving the right information to the public and also to drive the global response and deal with the politics and do all of those things at the same time. But luckily my job as chief scientist was not to deal with politics, but to focus on the more constructive and positive aspects. That is, what can we do to deal with this new virus? How do we create the diagnostics, the vaccines, the drugs? What are the mechanisms? Who are the people who need to be involved? What are the partnerships? How can we anticipate what's going to happen and start creating the policies that are needed, preparing the health systems for the massive vaccination campaigns and so on. So the three words that we used to use a lot, in fact the Director General used to use it in his speeches, was science, solutions and solidarity, because the idea was that science can provide the solutions, which it did eventually, but without solidarity at whatever level, global level or national level or local level, if you don't have solidarity, then those solutions may not be impactful. So I think we need to, that's a very good lesson for us also in our day-to-day work. Just because you think you have created a solution for something, if you have not involved the right partners and the right people, it is not going to lead to that intended impact. So science, solutions, solidarity is something that stuck with me as applying to many aspects beyond the pandemic. Many lessons I think can be learnt, and we need to learn those lessons because we can apply those lessons to our other work that we do. Though it was a very difficult period, so many millions of lives lost, livelihoods lost, I mean it's really, hopefully it's only once in a century, but unfortunately we don't know that, because one of the lessons I think to be learnt from the last 30, 40 years of looking at the emergence of new infectious diseases, or what we call emerging infections, is that this phenomenon is not a very, very rare phenomenon. If you look back, HIV we know came from non-human primates, so T. mangabes and the green African monkeys, HIV-1 and HIV-2. Ebola is another example of a disease that only was described in the 1970s, but obviously has been there for a long time. Again, it's a zoonotic because it is a disease of primates, and it spreads to humans when there is a close contact with the blood, body fluids. In the past, these things would happen in a localized setting, in a small village, in the bush, in the forest. A few people might die, but then the infection would die out because it could not spread beyond. Today we live in a world that's globalized. It is estimated that an infection which can spread rapidly, like SARS-CoV-2, if it arises in a village anywhere in the world, in 36 hours it can spread around the world. It takes only 36 hours. So you can...
Really special yesterday. We created this new thing called the Storm on Break, which means that your assembly is going to be able to have a look at any of the new EU laws that come down the pipe and say, hang on, if there's something that's really serious that we think is going to have a really big impact.
A lot of mammal species, and it is also infecting humans. Few people have died in Cambodia, including an 11-year-old girl. influenza is something that long was expected would cause the next pandemic, right? The 1918, what is known as the Spanish flu, but actually more people died in India. And it's not very well documented or talked about, but millions of people died in India at that time of the Spanish flu, which was right after the end of World War I. And it was mostly young people who died. So, after the Spanish flu 1918 to 1920, there have been at least 4 or 5 other influenza pandemics, but none of them have been to the extent where it has caused a very massive mortality, including 2009-10 when we had the H1N1 pandemic. But it turned out to be a very mild infection, so a lot of lives were not lost. Every year, but influenza is estimated to cause anywhere between 300 to 500,000 deaths. So about 500,000 people could be dying of flu every year. We don't even notice it because it's become a regular part of our lives, and that is how SARS-CoV-2 will also become. It's not going to disappear. When say people ask when is COVID going to end, there's no end in the sense that it is now endemic in humans, and therefore there will always be some people who will be more susceptible to severe disease, either because of their poor immune response or other risk factors, and they may also get sick, and we will always have that mortality and morbidity due to SARS-CoV-2. Over a period of time, it will become like influenza, where it can be more predictable pattern. It could be seasonal or may not be seasonal. We don't know. And we also don't know whether we are going to need a yearly booster or not of vaccine. So there are still unanswered questions about this virus. And the other risk is, of course, that the new variant could always come up. And this is why we need continued surveillance, genomic surveillance, which did not exist in the beginning. So again, one of the lessons, I started off by talking about the interrelationship between humans, animals and the environment, and things like globalization, illegal wildlife trade, deforestation, loss of biodiversity will increase the contact between humans, domestic animals and wild animals, and this is what actually creates a very good situation or environment for a new pathogen to jump from an animal to a different species. So this SARS-1, or the original SARS, was also a bat coronavirus. It came to humans through the civet cat, which are also cultivated and eaten in China. So we understand that MERS is another coronavirus. It is endemic in camels. It's also a bat coronavirus. Camel is the intermediate animal for humans. Similarly, we don't know yet for SARS-CoV-2. Could have come from bats, most likely, but how did it come and through which intermediate animal and so on, we don't know. But the Wuhan food market is most likely the wildlife market, most likely the place where this jump actually could have happened. So some of the risk factors we know, but still we have not changed our ways in the sense that environmental destruction continues, and as long as that keeps happening and we keep cutting forests and making less space for our wildlife, we will have more and more of these events. So I think I would say it's a question of if not, it's a question of when, not if, the next pandemic will happen. So all the more reason to be prepared, and this is not to scare everyone, but just to say that this is the reality. We don't know which virus. There are about 27 families of viruses which could cause severe human disease. So at the moment, the WHO and others are in the process of actually creating a directory or a compilation of these viral families with the most prototype virus in each group, which could then be used as a template for creating vaccines and so on. So the issue is, how do we prepare ourselves? Tomorrow, if there is some novel virus that creates an outbreak. In India, we have viruses which also create localized outbreaks. We have the Nipah virus, we have Japanese encephalitis, we've got the scrub typhus, we've got the Casanur forest disease. There are many diseases which were described in India and in surrounding Southeast Asian countries, for which we still may not have very good countermeasures, vaccines and so on. So for Nipah, for example, there is no vaccine or treatment, but there are some experimental agents which need to be tested. So unless you are prepared, with the first case of Nipah, you should be able to go in there and start vaccinating the contacts and start giving the monoclonal antibodies. So this is why you need a preparatory phase, which is today. We cannot wait. We need to have a document, we need to have protocols, we need to have everything done, and designs of the scientific studies, everything should be done in advance, so that when there is an outbreak, the scientists know exactly what to do and can very quickly act. This means including ethics approvals and regulatory approvals and all that. So investments in science, in R&D, in building human capacity for research, human resources, different types of human resources, right? You need for clinical work, epidemiology, you need vector biologists, entomologists, which are, by the way, in very short supply now. You need people, veterinarians probably. The whole concept of One Health today is all about thinking about animals, humans, environment as one, because we are all interconnected, and to believe that humans are superior and that we can deal with any problem that arises is not. It has been shown to be that we can be tamed by a virus. We cannot claim that we can. Of course, ultimately we find a solution, but not before we have to suffer a lot. So countries which have invested in science, invested in institutions and invested in people, and of course also which have a private sector that is capable of manufacturing at scale, they were the ones who were better off, because they could create these products, diagnostics, vaccines, etc., and they could manufacture them at scale. And of course India is known all over the world for its capacity for generic manufacturing. Probably what is needed now is again a sort of a master plan as to how we should use our capacities and capabilities to prepare for the future, and also to not wait for the next pandemic to come, but deal with the existing infectious disease problems we have today. We were talking about tuberculosis is still a huge problem. Nobody knows that tuberculosis kills 1.5 million people every year, and in the last 2 years the death due to TB has increased after many decades of decline because of the pandemic. Many diseases suffered because of the pandemic. Many people died because they could not access care, due to whether they had cancer or they had some other disease or they had malaria or TB. They could not access care, and so they could not be diagnosed, they could not be treated. So we have problems like malaria, TB, HIV, for which we still don't have good vaccines, dengue fever, chikungunya, lots of infectious diseases on which we should be creating better tools, and that will also prepare us to deal with an epidemic or outbreak or pandemic. So that is a very big lesson for all countries. I think whether they are rich or poor, they need to take it very seriously about investing in science. And that doesn't mean only the equipment. For example, genomic sequencing. Yes, India had capacity. We have sequencers all over the country in private and public, but we didn't have any system where these could work together, right? These labs. And many countries didn't have any sequencing capacity at all. But China, within the first 10 days of January 2020, had sequenced many of the viruses which they obtained from patients, and they put it on a public database called GISAID, which was set up for sharing influenza sequences. And later on they opened up a database for SARS-CoV-2, and today they have opened up for other viruses also, like RSV, as well as different types of influenza and all. So that sharing which they did on January 10th of 2020 is what enabled vaccine development to start and enabled diagnostic development to start. If those scientists had not shared the sequences, then the world would still be waiting to find out what is that new virus, right? So I think identification, having the capacity to do it, but then being able to share globally, particularly when it is something which affects the whole world, is important. And today in India we have this INSACOG network, which is a network of sequencing centers which was created for this purpose to track the variants and so on. They are still operating, though the volume I think has gone down significantly. But in the future we have to think about this. How do we share and nationally and globally, and then how do we act on the data that we get. And so this the old style handling of data, which everybody is protecting their data, keeping it to themselves, not sharing, that needs to change now, because otherwise science cannot advance. And so you hear a lot about open data, open access, open knowledge, and so on. I think for certain things it is important. For others, maybe there is issues of privacy, etc., or there could be sensitive, there could be very sensitive data which cannot be shared. But the large majority of data is not sensitive and does not have to be protected, and we need to find ways of sharing much more and working collaboratively. So that brings me to the next point, which is collaboration. And today, as you know, in science, the successful scientists are those who collaborate, and those, especially those who work in an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary way. And the fact that this mRNA platform was created, for the last 30 years, those scientists have been working on mRNA. They never knew that it will suddenly become useful during this pandemic. They were working for different applications, including cancer and also for other infectious diseases. But the whole challenge of how you can't inject mRNA because it is destroyed within few seconds, right? It's a protein and it will be immediately. So the whole challenge is how do you take that mRNA and put it into the body in a way in which the body can see the cells can see the signal and start synthesizing the protein. And that is where the lipid covering of the vaccine came, and that was being worked on by a different group of people who work on lipids. So it was collaboration between scientists that actually finally gave the formulation that was successful. And so for many things, like at the WHO, the whole work of WHO is based on global networks of scientists. It's not WHO, few people sitting and doing. It is all the work of scientists around the world that WHO coordinates and brings together and maybe sets the agenda. So it's a more of a coordinating function. That's what we did. So in February 2020, we had a massive global research and innovation forum, and we came with a roadmap for research into this novel virus. At that time, everything was an unknown, so we listed all the gaps of knowledge, we listed all the research priorities, we created a lot of networks and groups of people, started working together. Every few months we would have a massive online meeting, but otherwise there were smaller meetings happening, but every few months massive meeting to disseminate all the knowledge that had been gained, putting it out. And so that is what actually led to fast tracking of research. Of course, all the journals made the open access, the pre-publication repositories, they made everything open access. So there was an overflow of information also. So that again we had to deal with, because we had to make recommendations based on reliable data. Not all the data that was coming is equally high quality. So we had to have a system of being able to review and use the data which was high quality to make our guidelines and recommendations. So collaboration and interdisciplinary, we had a social science group, we had an ethics group, because we knew there'll be lots of ethical questions that come up during the pandemic. Contact tracing, is it an invasion of privacy? Mandatory vaccination, some countries went for mandatory vaccination policy. What is the ethics behind that? Human challenge studies. Can you actually do human challenge studies with this virus? So we had at least 8 or 10 or 12 topics on which our ethics group actually came out with very good documents that didn't tell you what to do. In ethics, it's never black and white, right? You have to make a judgment call. So it's the situation, you have to consider the facts. And so we had many of those groups actually working day and night and creating those resources for people to use. And as I mentioned, the WHO's role was to be the global coordinating agency, but also to set benchmarks, because we are a normative, WHO is a normative agency. When I say we, I'm no longer in WHO, but it's a normative agency. That means you make, you set standards, guidelines, recommendations, benchmarks. So what does a successful vaccine look like? If nobody gives any definition, then how are the companies going to test the vaccine? So very early on, in March and April of 2020, we had already put out the target product profiles for vaccine, for drugs, for diagnostics, which the regulatory agencies also, they took that, and we were all aligned. So the FDA and WHO and the European agencies and Indian, all regulators were aligned as to what will be the benchmark. Of course, the vaccines were much better than what had been expected in terms of efficacy. So our benchmark was ultimately had to be revised upwards, but at least we had something to start with. And of course, again, the policy work had to be done by us. Once a vaccine is developed, how do you use it? Who do you give it to? What are the things to be monitored? What are the age groups? Are there any adverse events, etc.? Those need to be constantly monitored and updated. And I think the other thing that was important was that this was all being done in a mission mode. So we had a goal, everybody had the same goal, people were contributing different things to it, but it is what is called a mission mode, and that was the reason for, I think, getting a vaccine within 11 months. Ethics, and I mentioned, always important to consider the ethical aspects, but also equity, and that is where we saw a lot of problems of countries not having access to the products. The rich countries had access, the countries which had their own manufacturing capacity like India had access, but many of the countries in Africa were just waiting and waiting and waiting because they did not, they were dependent on vaccines coming from other parts of the world. So I think self-reliance is extremely important. Distributed manufacturing, if you have manufacturing in one part of the world, during an emergency, you may or may not have access to that product. Countries also look at their own citizens first, so they also block exports, stop, the border. That was happening. All the countries were doing that. So many of the countries, particularly on the African continent, realized that they were left to fend for themselves, and therefore we then started a program of technology transfer, where we said that we would have a network of labs in low middle income countries that would use the publicly available information and create mRNA vaccines from scratch. That is going very well. There are 16 countries involved, including India. The hub is in South Africa, and I hope that in the next few years we will see a lot of new innovation coming from this network. It's completely a South-South kind of collaboration that we actually initiated and set up. Everybody told me at that time that this was a failure, this is going to not work, ridiculous idea, nobody is going to support it. But today everybody thinks it's a good idea and they want to support it. Of course, there are lots of issues. It's not an easy thing to do, and especially when you have big pharma involved, there's likely to be issues around IP and patents and legal, and all that will have to be navigated. But the idea is, if there is a need for a product which saves lives, then that product must be available to everybody. It should not be in the hands of few companies who are maximizing profits. So that was the philosophy behind the technology mRNA technology transfer program that we started. So equity has to be also at the heart of things we do in India as well, because within countries also there is inequity. It's not only between countries, right? Even if you look within the country, you can see the inequity in access to services, including access to healthcare and products. So when we generate some new knowledge, we have to think about how do we make it available to people at an affordable way, in an equitable way, and that is especially for people who are doing government funded science. We are using taxpayer money, right, to do the science, and therefore the returns must also go to the public. Regulatory science is very important. I think it is not given enough priority, because when you create a new product, it has to move through a pathway for regulation, whether it's a drug or a vaccine, or whether it's some new digital product or a medical device. It has to be regulated. Anything which can affect human health needs to go through a medical regulator, and so the regulatory science is also advancing a lot. It did advance a lot during the pandemic. There was a lot more collaboration, a lot more thinking about how to accelerate licensing of products in a safe way. Because people often ask me, how can we be sure that these vaccines are safe? They were developed so quickly, started using them so quickly. Today we know 14-15 billion doses of the vaccine have been administered around the world. Yes, there are side effects, but if you look at the benefits and the lives saved, then the side effects comparatively are minor and can be acceptable, because nothing is going to be 100% safe. So it's always a balance between benefit and risk. Whenever you take a medicine, it's a balance between benefit and risk. So that needs to be explained also to people, and the regulators need to be very clear about how they go about regulating, approving something, or giving emergency approval. If people don't understand the process, then there will always be doubt. The last two lessons really, one is around community engagement, community participation. You see that in many countries a vaccine hesitancy has meant that despite vaccine being available, people are not taking it, right? In fact, I recently saw that in 2 states in America, their courts or their government, local government, has actually said that they won't give COVID vaccine. So it became a strangely political thing, but it also fueled a lot of hesitancy in people, because people got confused when they heard all these different things, and so whenever you need behavior change, like for COVID, we were relying entirely on behavior change, right? We're telling people stay apart from each other, wear your mask, wash your hands, open your doors and windows, stay away from crowds, stay away from closed environment, and all those things. All are behavior change issues. And so behavior change requires social science and behavioral science, and it requires a different approach to public health, and it requires taking the public into confidence, explaining frequently, communicating. So communication is extremely important for scientists. Many times we don't communicate very well, or we don't communicate in a language that is well understood. Plus, of course, as I mentioned, during the pandemic, we got what is called an infodemic. Pandemic, epidemic is the virus, infodemic is the information overload that everybody was subjected to, right? All the time on social media, on WhatsApp, TV, newspaper. Lot of things coming. You don't know what is right, what is wrong. And particularly WhatsApp, I think, is the biggest culprit. People rely on WhatsApp to get their information, unfortunately, today. And in many countries, it's true. At least in India, we have access to a lot of information. But I've talked to people in some African countries who say that their main source of information is WhatsApp, because they would rather believe that than believe what is being told to them in the national news. So this is a danger. Social media has 2 sides. Good side is that you can communicate, you can link with people, you can spread your ideas, etc. But the bad side of it is that bad ideas, wrong ideas, and very dangerous ideas will also spread. They did spread, and they continue to spread. So I think for some reason I think not in India so much, but in the West, there is a big anti-science movement, and they are unfortunately going to have an impact around the world. So we can't say that, oh, we are fine, and we have to be watchful. And one thing that our people have to learn is, how do you distinguish when you see a WhatsApp forward? You're going to believe everything that's written in it, or are you going to think about whether it sounds, like suspicious, and then you must make some more inquiry about it rather than just forward that WhatsApp to another 25 contacts. That is how these things go viral. Whether you read or not, whether you believe or not, you first forward it. So that is a trend which is not good. We have to apply our minds, and people have to think. And that is what is called scientific literacy or health literacy, when you are able to distinguish when you are told something about whether it's a rational thing or it is completely irrational. Bill Gates is injecting chips into everybody through this is a big conspiracy theory that was going around. Don't take the vaccine because Bill Gates will control you. Is it possible? Is it possible for one man to put chips into what chips is he going to put? And what about all the agencies like WHO and country ministries which are recommending the vaccine? Will they recommend if it is all a chip that's being introduced into people? So a lot of conspiracy theories nowadays go around. So one has to be very careful about what you believe. And that, has to start with a good science education, I think, in schools. And just learning how to think and distinguish. So communication is extremely important. I think maybe for scientists, we don't have any training. We don't have, so I think this is a lesson for us as well, because it's not only health, but all aspects of science need to be communicated to public, because today, like whether it's environment or climate change, or building or road construction, or why you want to do certain things in a certain way, really needs to be communicated. So I think that is something for the future that we need to work on more. But particularly when you have an emergency situation, then that communication becomes even more important. Whether it's a natural disaster or whether it's a pandemic or something else, there needs to be very well coordinated and clear communication to people to keep down the panic, but at the same time you're giving them the right information, telling them what they should do and why they should do it. So I think that to me were most of the lessons of the pandemic, and the only satisfaction for me, of course, it was terrible to keep on seeing all the news from around the world and see the suffering that people were going through. But at least I felt that I could contribute through the science division, working with a global network of scientists, made me very proud and happy to see how people actually work together. There was no ego, there was nothing, there was no holding back. It was all about, let us solve this problem together. So that is why it makes me believe, very optimistic, that when we want to, actually as scientists, we can come together and solve many of the issues that face us today. It just needs the will, and it needs some leadership, and it needs a coordination. But I think that gives a lot of hope. And many young people are also now getting into science, so that's again a very good trend. I think science got a lot of importance during the pandemic, and people have started seeing the value of this. So thank you very much for inviting me to share my views, and I wish you all a happy National Science Day.
Thank you, ma'am. We are indeed very honored to have listened to you today, and thank you for sharing some of the experiences as part of WHO on lessons learned during the pandemic, and also highlighting the roadmap on how such situation can be handled in future. Thank you, ma'am. To express our heartfelt gratitude to our chief guest for spending her valuable time with us, I request our director, ma'am, to present a memento to our chief guest. I now request Dr. K.J. Sriram, Director CSIR CLRI, to deliver the vote of thanks.
A very good evening. Teams of CSIR, CRC, CMC and CLRI. It was a thought process that had existed between me and Dr. Anandavalli that there have to be a better collaboration between the laboratories that are situated in Chennai rather than we working in silos. The only way in which the scientists of these labs knew each other was when they meet in the staff quarters if they were staying in the common pool accommodation, or when experts of one lab were going to the other lab for the assessment and other things. To be very frank, the pandemic actually taught us a lesson, because when we were working on containment, we were predominantly looking at the containment of the virus at the staff quarters, and at that point of time I had to on a daily basis be interacting with SCRC and CMC to ensure that there was no cross movement of this virus and then getting into the staff quarters. But anyway, today, this lecture, when CLRI, SCRC and CMC decided that we will do it together, we have set a new pathway for the CSIR laboratories in various cities to join hands together, not just to come and sit together for a lecture, but to actually initiate a way forward for collaborating in science, irrespective of what kind of science that we are doing in our laboratories. Dr. Soumya in her lecture spoke about students, community engagement, and the good work that we need to do to maximize these outcomes. It is one area where we now can look forward to working with MSSRF, because CSIR does the Jigyasa, where we work with the KV students, and MSSRF is talking about every child is a scientist. More or less, thematically, the same activity, and possibly we should all work together to ensure that the next generation is looking forward to the best science that can come out from them. Dr. Soumya spoke about the laboratories working together in the area of genomics globally. We all know that the CSIR labs had got together for testing and also in the genomics component. And even labs like CLRI had got into the testing activity, which was something which we never thought we will do. In the whole process, I can also tell you that the labs were also getting in touch with hospitals, the corporation and whatnot, so that we could really understand where we were all going forward. And this, to me, is a good illustration that we should take as a lesson from the pandemic. And as Madam said, the virus was only taught us something which we should take it forward and not to forget. Friends, I think this National Science Day celebrations today, I must say that Dr. Soumya has given us a good illustration of collaborating for the betterment of the society, taking the pandemic as an example. It's time that we all who are assembled here and those who are not should come back together and ensure that we do the global best in science for the best of the people who are around us. Thank you very much, Dr. Soumya, for your readily acceptance to come to us today, and the way in which you have illustrated how science can be bettered through collaborations. I must also take this opportunity to thank every one of you who have assembled here, and I hope we will all be able to take this lesson of collaborating in science forward. I cannot stop without thanking the media, and I hope their presence today in this program would also take forward this lesson that all scientists in the world should collaborate with each other. Of course, as was said by Dr. Soumya, there could be hurdles, there could be issues, but we can all sort that out if we have a mind to collaborate. So thank you for your presence here, and I also take this opportunity to thank the team of SCRC for having made this program in a very wonderful manner, and I am sure that as we move forward, there will be programs where these labs would always come together and share thoughts and expertises together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. This brings us to the end of today's function. I thank each and every one of you for joining this event and making it a grand success. Please rise for national anthem.
Himalaya